Why Your Life Isn't Working, and the One Thing That Fixes It. Carl Jung, 1010. Carl Jung observed that most of what we call misfortune is simply the unconscious mind, unexamined, working its way out into the world through us. So let's begin there, quietly, by the fire, with something he wrote plainly and without decoration. Jung wrote in his collected works that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Which is to say, the part of you that you refuse to look at does not disappear. It only grows heavier in the dark, waiting near the door of every relationship, every job, every quiet Sunday evening when the noise stops and you are left alone with yourself. And here is the line underneath that thought. The reason your life may feel like it keeps repeating the same argument with a different face, the same disappointment wearing a new coat, it is because what is not made conscious does not go away. It comes back dressed as circumstance. So let's make this personal before we go any further. Here is a resolution, 3 parts, said in the first person, present tense, and I want you to say it with me. I am willing to see what I have been avoiding. I stop blaming the world for what belongs to me. I make the unconscious conscious. Say it with me. I am willing to see what I have been avoiding. I stop blaming the world for what belongs to me. I make the unconscious conscious. And again, slower this time. Let it land. I am willing to see what I have been avoiding. I stop blaming the world for what belongs to me. I make the unconscious conscious. Good. Now, before we go further, if that landed somewhere true, type the 2 words, face it, in the comments. Just those 2 words. It costs nothing, and it tells the part of you that just spoke something up, that it was heard. The first key is that your persona is not you, and mistaking it for you is the quiet beginning of a life that stops working. Jung defined the persona plainly. He wrote that the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. And notice how careful that sentence is. It does not say the persona is false exactly. It says it is a role, a necessary one, the face you show at work, the composed parent, the reasonable friend, the competent professional who never seems rattled. There is nothing wrong with having a persona. Jung was not a man who wanted you to walk into the office and announce your every private feeling. The persona is a civilizing garment. It lets society function. It lets you function. Think of it as a coat you put on for the weather outside. Useful, even necessary. The trouble only begins the moment you forget you are wearing a coat at all and start to believe the coat is your skin. Jung once treated a successful surgeon, a man so composed, so admired, so thoroughly identified with his own competence, that he came to Jung not because anything had visibly failed, but because he felt, in his own words, like a stranger standing behind his own face, he could perform the role flawlessly, greet colleagues, comfort patients, deliver difficult news with perfect steadiness, and feel, underneath all of it, almost nothing. The persona had grown so thick that it had quietly replaced the person who once wore it. This happens in smaller ways too. The parent who is endlessly cheerful for the children and cannot recall the last time they let their face fall. The friend everyone calls the strong one, who has never once been permitted, by anyone including themselves, to be the weak one for an evening. So ask yourself gently tonight, when the door is closed and no one is watching, who is left? If the answer is uncertain, that uncertainty is not a failure. It is the first honest thing you have felt all week, and honesty, however uncomfortable, is where this whole journey begins. The second key is that the shadow is not your enemy. It is the part of yourself you have refused to be, and it is far more interesting than you have been told. Jung wrote that the meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow, and he meant this almost like a doorway. You cannot get to anything deeper in the psyche without walking through this room first. And he also wrote plainly that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is, which tells you something important. The shadow is not fixed in size. It grows precisely in proportion to how much you refuse to look at it. Now here is what most people misunderstand about the shadow. They think it is only the ugly things, the rage, the envy, the cruelty we would rather not admit, and yes, those live there. But Jung was insistent that the shadow also contains gold, unlived talents, buried spontaneity, the creativity you decided as a child was too loud or too strange or too much, and packed away to be acceptable. The shy man may be hiding a shadow of boldness he never let himself use. The endlessly nice woman may be hiding a shadow of appetite, of hunger, of a voice that once knew how to say no. Think of the person who was told early on that anger was unacceptable in their household, so they became endlessly pleasant, endlessly accommodating, the peacemaker at every gathering, the one who smooths things over before they even begin, and 30 years later, they cannot understand why they feel hollow, why resentment leaks out sideways in small sarcastic comments, in exhaustion that has no medical name, in a strange coldness toward the very people they claim to love most. The anger did not vanish because it was forbidden, it went underground, and what goes underground does not weaken. It organizes, it waits, it learns to speak in disguise. Jung once treated a highly rational man, a man who prided himself on being reasonable above all things, logical, unemotional, in control, the kind of man who believed he had simply outgrown his temper. And this man kept finding himself in furious arguments he could not explain, disproportionate to whatever had triggered them, a delayed train, a misplaced set of keys, a comment at dinner, and what emerged, slowly, in the work, was a rage he had never once been permitted to feel as a child, dressed now as adult reasonableness, arguing about parking spaces and dinner reservations. The very calm he prided himself on had simply been feeding the fire it claimed not to have. Picture something closer to home, the ordinary evening when a partner leaves a single dish in the sink, and it detonates something in you far larger than a dish could ever deserve. The voice rises, the old grievances arrive uninvited, and later, alone. You wonder where all that came from. That is the shadow surfacing, uninvited but not unannounced. It had been knocking for years. The shadow does not ask for your permission. It asks for your attention. And the practice here is not exotic. It is simply this. When you catch yourself reacting with more heat than the moment deserves, pause and ask, what in me is this touching? Not what is wrong with them. What in me is this touching? That single redirection of the question is where shadow work quietly begins. In the kitchen, in the car, in the comment section. Nowhere dramatic, everywhere ordinary. And slowly, patiently, what was once denser and blacker for having been ignored begins to come into the light, where it can finally be known instead of merely obeyed. The third key is projection, and this is the one that will change how you see every argument you have ever had. Jung wrote that projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. And I want you to sit with the strangeness of that sentence. It means the world you are reacting to so intensely, the coworker who infuriates you, the family member whose flaws you cannot stop cataloging, the stranger in traffic who ruins your whole afternoon, may be wearing, at least in part, a face that belongs to you. Here is the mechanism. Plainly, whatever we cannot bear to see in ourselves does not simply sit quietly inside us. It gets thrown outward, unconsciously, onto someone else, and then we experience it as coming from them, we feel certain of it, we would swear to it in court. And the tell, the one reliable signal that projection is at work, is disproportionate emotional charge. When your reaction to someone is bigger than the situation calls for, When you find yourself endlessly irritated by a trait in another person that a stranger would barely notice, that heat is data. Jung put it directly. He said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Not everything about others is a projection. People do have real faults, real limitations, real unkindness sometimes. But the size of your reaction, the way it keeps you up at night, the way you rehearse the argument in the shower long after it's over, the way one person's small comment can occupy your mind for 3 days while a dozen larger annoyances slide off you unnoticed. That intensity is usually not about them at all. It is about the part of you that trait is standing in for. Consider something as ordinary as a dinner table, a family gathering, and one relative who cannot stop talking about their own accomplishments. And you notice yourself growing quietly furious, disproportionately so, while everyone else at the table seems mildly amused and moves on. That gap between your reaction and theirs is worth pausing on, because it may not be their boasting that wounds you. It may be your own unspoken hunger to be seen, a hunger you learned long ago to bury under modesty, so now it lives outside you, in the relative, where you can safely resent it instead of grieving your own silence. Consider the woman who cannot stand people who are too ambitious, who rolls her eyes at every colleague who reaches for more, and yet if you sat with her long enough, you might find a woman who once wanted enormous things for herself and was taught, early and thoroughly, that wanting was unbecoming. So now the ambition lives outside her, in others, where she can safely despise it instead of grieving it. Or consider the man endlessly annoyed by weakness in others, impatient with anyone who seems fragile or afraid, quick to call it laziness, quick to call it excuse-making. And underneath that impatience, if you are willing to look, often sits a man terrified of his own fragility, who long ago decided that fear was unacceptable in a man like him, and so he polices it wherever he finds it, everywhere except in the mirror. He has made an entire personality out of not being the thing he is most afraid of being. This is not comfortable knowledge. Jung was honest about that. He wrote that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. And projection is one of the great absurd strategies. It lets us feel righteous while remaining unconscious. It lets us fight a war outside so we never have to open the door inside. It is, in a strange way, almost soothing, because as long as the fault lives out there, in them, we are spared the harder work of finding it in here. And notice too how projection is rarely a single event. It tends to attach itself to the same kind of person again and again, so if you find that a certain type keeps appearing in your life as the villain of the story, the arrogant boss, the needy friend, the cold parent figure, wherever you go, it is worth asking whether the world is really that consistently unkind, or whether you keep meeting the same unclaimed part of yourself wearing different coats. So here is the practice, not a cure, a discipline. The next time someone irritates you far more than the moment warrants, before you speak, before you build the case against them in your mind, ask quietly, what is this showing me about myself? You do not have to answer immediately. You do not have to like the answer when it comes, but the asking itself begins to withdraw the projection, begins to bring the face back home to where it has belonged all along. The fourth key is that complexes can have you long before you notice they exist, and this is perhaps the most quietly humbling thing Jung ever taught. We like to imagine the psyche as a single unified thing, one continuous I, steering the ship from a calm bridge, making decisions, choosing reactions, staying consistent from morning to night. But Jung's clinical work convinced him otherwise. He found that the psyche is more like a loose confederation of semi-independent centers, clusters of memory and emotion and belief, organized around a theme, usually a wound, and he called these complexes. And he was careful to say, this is not pathology, it is simply how a psyche is built. The same way a body has organs it does not consciously direct. The heart does not ask permission to beat, and in much the same way, a complex does not ask permission to speak. A complex forms around an emotional charge that was never resolved, an early humiliation, a parent's coldness, a moment of shame that got buried instead of digested, a fear that had nowhere safe to go, and once formed, the complex behaves almost like a separate personality living inside the larger one. It has its own memory, its own logic, its own voice, its own timing, and when something in the present brushes against its particular nerve, the complex does not wait to be invited, it simply takes the wheel, and the strange part is how convincing it feels from the inside. In the moment it takes over, it does not feel like an old wound speaking, it feels like the truth. It feels like you, finally being honest. Let me give you an ordinary evening, nothing dramatic. A man comes home from work. His wife asks, gently, almost offhandedly, whether he remembered to call the plumber, and something in him ignites, not mild irritation, something closer to fury. He hears himself saying that she never trusts him to handle anything, that she treats him like a child. His voice has gone up an octave he does not recognize. His wife is staring at him because 6 words about a plumber have somehow become a referendum on his entire worth as a man. And later that night, lying awake, some quieter part of him, watching from a distance, thinks, "Why did I react like that?" It was one sentence. That quieter part is the ego, momentarily displaced from its own house. And the fury that answered did not belong entirely to the grown man standing in the kitchen. It belonged to a boy, decades younger, who grew up under a father's constant supervision, whose every action was checked and corrected and found wanting, and who built, without ever choosing to, an entire alarm system around the theme of being doubted. That alarm system is still wired into him, still live, and one ordinary sentence about a plumber was enough to trip it. Jung once described patients who could speak with total composure about almost anything, their finances, their marriages, even their childhoods, calmly, reasonably, until one particular subject arose, and suddenly the voice changed, the breathing changed, the words came faster, or stopped altogether entirely. The eyes moved differently. He called this hitting a complex, the way your foot might strike a buried root beneath calm-looking grass. You did not know the root was there. The grass gave no warning, and yet down you go. And he noticed again and again that the size of the reaction was the clue. Wherever the emotional charge outweighs the actual event by a wide margin, wherever a small comment produces a large storm, a complex is close by, working underground, using the present moment as a stage for old business. And here is what makes this so easy to miss in our own lives. A complex almost never announces itself as old. It always disguises itself as a fresh, fully justified reaction to what is happening right now. The man in the kitchen was certain, in the moment, that his wife's tone was the problem, that her question really did carry doubt in it. He was not lying. He simply could not see that the size of his response belonged to a scene 40 years in the past. Wearing the coat of tonight, this is why Jung insisted the question is never whether you have complexes. Everyone does, without exception. The question is only whether you know them, because an unknown complex runs the show entirely from behind a curtain, dictating your worst arguments, your strangest overreactions, your sudden inexplicable moods, while a known complex, however uncomfortable to acknowledge, becomes something you can finally have a relationship with, instead of being silently possessed by. The difference is not whether the old wound exists. The difference is whether you are its author or its instrument. Think also of the mother who cannot bear even the mildest suggestion that she has made a mistake with her children, who receives ordinary feedback as an accusation of total failure, and reacts with a defensiveness that seems entirely out of scale with whatever was actually said. If you trace that reaction backward, gently, without judgment, You might find a girl who was once made to feel that any error was unforgivable, that love in her house was conditional on being flawless, and so an entire complex organized itself around the theme of never being allowed to fail, and now, 30 years later, it answers for her before she has even decided how she wants to respond. The practice here is patient observation, not diagnosis, not self-accusation, and certainly not a hunt for hidden villains inside yourself. Simply noticing, when do I stop sounding like myself? When does my voice change register? When do I say something in the heat of a moment and then think afterward, that wasn't really about the dishes, was it? That wasn't really about the plumber. That wasn't really about the comment on the report. Each time you notice this gap between the size of the trigger and the size of your response, you loosen the complex's grip slightly. Not because noticing dissolves it entirely and forever. Complexes are stubborn residents. They do not pack up and leave after a single insight, but because a complex that is seen loses some of its power to act in the dark, it can no longer wear the mask of simple present-tense truth so easily. And Jung's whole method rested on this quiet, almost modest principle, that consciousness, however small the flashlight, however partial the light it throws, changes the nature of what it touches. The root beneath the grass may still be there tomorrow, but you will know, at last, where to step. The fifth key is that your dreams are not nonsense. They are compensation, a nightly correction from a part of you wiser than your daytime opinions about yourself. Jung broke early and decisively from the idea that a dream is merely a disguise for some forbidden wish, something to be decoded once and thrown away. He came to see the dream instead as a kind of internal parliament, a nightly session in which the parts of you that daylight consciousness overrules finally get to speak, and what they say, again and again, is not random noise but correction, the unconscious noticing where the conscious attitude has grown too narrow, too rigid, too pleased with its own certainty, and offering through image rather than argument exactly what has been left out of the room. Think of the psyche as a household, and the ego as the one member of that household who does all the talking during the day, who decides what the family is like, who presents the official version of things to the neighbors, and the dream as the hour after midnight when everyone else in the house, the ones who were never given a vote, finally gets to say what they actually think. Compensation does not mean contradiction for its own sake. It means balance. It means the unconscious quietly insisting that the picture is not complete. Consider the executive who prides himself on total control, who has built his entire waking identity on competence, on being the calm one, the reliable one, the man who never seems rattled in a crisis, and who begins, without any obvious cause, to dream repeatedly of drowning, of black water rising past his knees, past his waist, of being swept somewhere he cannot direct or resist. Jung would not read that water as a warning about literal danger. He would read it as the unconscious registering something the conscious mind refuses to admit in daylight, that beneath all that mastery, there is a man who has not truly rested in years, who has mistaken constant vigilance for strength, and the water keeps rising in the dream because something in him is drowning quietly, while the daytime self insists everything is fine. Or consider, from another angle entirely, the woman who has spent her adult life being endlessly agreeable, who cannot remember the last time she said no without apologizing first, whose whole persona has been built around being easy, undemanding, low maintenance, and who dreams, night after night, of a wild animal locked behind a door in a house she recognizes as her childhood home, a door she keeps meaning to check and somehow keeps forgetting. That animal is not a threat sent to frighten her. Jung would say, it is closer to a messenger. It is carrying back to her exactly what she exiled long ago in order to be loved. Her hunger, her appetite for her own life, her capacity to refuse, and the dream keeps returning because the message has not yet been received in daylight. Notice that in both cases, the dream is not telling the dreamer what they want to hear, it is telling them what they have refused to hear. This is the compensatory function at work. And it is why dreams so often feel strange, even unwelcome. When we first sit with them honestly, they are not flattering us, they are correcting us, the way a level corrects a wall that looks straight to the eye, but is quietly, dangerously off. Dreams speak a different language than the daylight mind. Image instead of argument, symbol instead of statement. And this is precisely why they frustrate people who want a quick translation, who want to look up water or animal or falling in some tidy little dictionary and walk away with an answer. Jung was deeply suspicious of exactly that kind of shortcut. He did not believe a symbol carried one fixed meaning, stamped the same way for every dreamer. A house in one dream is not a house in another. Water for the drowning executive is not water for someone who grew up sailing with a beloved grandfather. The meaning of the image depends on the dreamer's whole inner landscape, and this is why Jung insisted a dream must be approached almost as you would approach a person, with patience, with humility, without assuming in advance that you already know what it is going to say. He kept his own dream journal for decades, recording images that sometimes made no immediate sense at all, and he treated the practice not as decoding, but as ongoing conversation. One dream answering a question the previous week's dream had raised. A figure returning months later slightly changed, as though something in him were slowly working out a thought too large to be said all at once. And this is the model worth borrowing, not a single dream cracked open like a locked box, but a relationship sustained over time, the way you would come to know a person by many conversations, rather than one interrogation. So here is a simple practice. Nothing elaborate. Keep paper by the bed. Nothing more sophisticated is required. And when you wake, before the day's obligations arrive and paper over whatever remains, write down whatever you can recover, even if it is only a fragment, only a color, only a feeling with no clear picture attached to it at all. Do not rush to interpret it in that first sitting. Resist the urge to immediately explain it away, which is usually the ego trying to regain control of a message it did not authorize. Let it sit instead. Come back to it after a few days. And after a few weeks of this, you will likely notice something Jung noticed constantly in his own patients, a pattern surfacing on its own, a recurring location that keeps appearing, a figure who returns again and again wearing different faces but the same posture, a recurring sensation of being chased or trapped, or unexpectedly moved to tears by something that made no sense in the moment. And when that pattern shows itself clearly enough to name, the question worth asking is quiet but exact. What have I been unwilling to see in daylight, that this keeps insisting on showing me at night? Jung wrote a line that belongs directly here. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes. And there is a real reversal worth sitting with in that sentence. We are trained from childhood to think of the dream as the unreal thing, wispy, forgettable, and of waking life as the solid ground beneath our feet. But consider how much of what passes for waking life is itself a kind of unexamined daydream, run on assumptions never questioned, roles never chosen consciously, fears inherited so early we mistook them for facts about the world, while the actual dream, strange and inconvenient as it looks in the cold light of morning, may be the one honest hour each day when something true finally gets past the guard at the door. The sixth key, and the one everything else has been quietly building toward, is that the goal of all this was never to fix yourself. Jung was explicit that individuation is not the same as perfection. It is the slow, unglamorous work of becoming whole, of integrating what has been split off rather than trying to amputate it. This bears repeating because the culture around us so often teaches the opposite. It tells us to eliminate the negative, to banish the shadow, to think only bright thoughts, to cut out whatever part of ourselves seems inconvenient. Jung's entire clinical life pointed the other direction. He wrote that no tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell, meaning that height without depth is not health. It is imbalance waiting to collapse. The person who tries to be only light becomes brittle, becomes prone to sudden dark moods they cannot explain, because what is refused entry through the front door climbs in through a window. Wholeness, in Jung's sense, means something closer to honesty than to virtue. It means being able to say, yes, that impulse belongs to me too, that fear, that appetite, that capacity for cruelty, that also, and holding it without either acting it out blindly or pretending it isn't there. This holding has a name in Jung's work. He called it the tension of opposites, the ability to stand between two true but conflicting things. I love this person, and I am furious at them. I am ambitious, and I am afraid. I want closeness, and I want solitude, without collapsing prematurely into either side. And here is the part that sounds almost mystical, but was, for Jung, simply clinical observation. When you can hold that tension honestly, without forcing a resolution, without lying to make the discomfort go away, something new tends to emerge on its own, not chosen by the conscious mind, not willed into being, but arising, almost like a birth. From the friction of the two opposites held together long enough, Jung called this the transcendent function, the psyche's own capacity to produce a third thing, a new attitude, a new symbol, a new way forward that neither side could have generated alone. Jung once worked with a man torn between duty and desire, a marriage he felt bound to honor, and a longing for something he could not name. And the man wanted Jung to simply tell him which side was right, which choice to make. And Jung would not do it, not because he did not care, but because he understood that collapsing the tension prematurely would only produce a shallow resolution, a decision made to escape discomfort, rather than one that had actually grown from within. So instead, the work was to stay in the tension, to feel both pulls fully and honestly, and over time something did emerge, not the answer the man expected, but a genuinely new relationship to his own life, one he could not have reasoned his way into, only lived his way into. This is why Jung distinguished the ego so carefully from what he called the self. The ego is the center of your conscious identity, the I that thinks it is running things, useful, necessary, but partial. The self is larger. It is the organizing center of the whole psyche, conscious and unconscious together. And individuation is the long, often uncomfortable process of the ego coming into right relationship with that larger self, not replacing it, not merging into some blissful dissolution, but learning to serve something wider than its own small preferences. And here Jung offered one more piece of honesty that many people find hard to hear at first. He wrote that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering, meaning that some pain cannot be bypassed, some griefs must simply be grieved, some truths about ourselves must simply be faced, and when we refuse that legitimate suffering, when we detour around it with distraction or denial or blame, the psyche does not let us off the hook. It produces symptoms instead: anxiety with no clear object, exhaustion with no medical cause, a low static hum of dissatisfaction that follows us from one circumstance to the next because we keep changing the furniture instead of addressing the room. Jung also wrote a sentence that sits well at the end of this key: we cannot change anything until we accept it. And notice this is not resignation. Acceptance in Jung's sense is not surrender to fate. It is the precondition for real movement. You cannot integrate a shadow you refuse to admit exists. You cannot withdraw a projection you insist is simply the truth about someone else. You cannot outgrow a complex you have never once noticed gripping the wheel. Acceptance is simply consciousness turned toward what is actually there, and it is always the doorway, never the destination. For those who want to go further into the interior, Jung spoke of a practice he called active imagination, a deliberate, waking engagement with the images and figures of the inner world, but he was careful, almost stern, in saying, "This requires a steady footing in ordinary outer life first, a settled routine, a grounded daily reality. Without that footing, the inner work can become disorienting rather than illuminating. So this is not a technique for a moment of crisis. It is a discipline for a life already reasonably stable, approached slowly, and ideally alongside real conversation with people you trust, not undertaken alone in the dark as some kind of shortcut. Here is the whole picture, seen all at once. Your persona is a mask worth wearing, but never worth becoming. Your shadow holds both the darkness you fear and the gold you abandoned. Your projections are the unconscious wearing other people's faces, so you don't have to look at your own. Your complexes can quietly steer you until you learn to recognize their particular voice. Your dreams are not noise, but nightly compensation, trying to widen a life that has grown too narrow. And the whole of it moves not toward perfection, but toward wholeness, toward the ego learning humility before the larger self, toward holding opposites long enough that something new is finally allowed to be born. None of this is quick, and none of it was ever meant to be. Jung spent his own life doing this work, and still called it unfinished. The greatest and most important problems of life, he wrote, can never be solved, but only outgrown, which means the aim was never to arrive at some final tidy self, with no more shadow, no more complex, no more tension. The aim was to keep growing large enough that the old problems stop fitting. The way a coat you wore as a child simply no longer fits the shoulders of the adult you became. So let's return to where we started. The resolution. Say it with me one more time. I am willing to see what I have been avoiding. I stop blaming the world for what belongs to me. I make the unconscious conscious. And if any part of this hour found something true in you, something you had sensed but never named, put it plainly in 2 words below. Face it. Because Jung wrote that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside. As fate, and the whole quiet purpose of everything we've walked through tonight has been this one reversal, to bring what has been happening to you back inside, where it can finally, honestly, be met. So here is the question to leave burning by the fire tonight. Not why isn't your life working, but what have you been refusing to see that has been living it for you instead?